On the 17th of April 1975, Pol Pot's army marched into Phnom Penh. They were called the Khmer Rouge, the Red Khmer. Khmer is the main ethnic group of Cambodia, and red, of course, was the colour of communism. Within 48 hours, the Khmer Rouge had closed schools and offices, places of worship and entertainment, hospitals, factories and police stations. Every man, woman and child in the cities, no matter what their age or health, was forced to leave. Families were split and sent in different directions. In 3 days, every city was empty. They were sent to work nights and days without rest and without any food. These places were called collective farms, but they were really cruel places of forced labour. Pol Pot believed in a class struggle between capitalists and workers. He envisaged a pure communal society led by those who worked on the land. City people, their corrupt institutions and personal possessions had to be destroyed. He set out to begin anew at what came to be called Year Zero. He claimed the peasants were his heroes. He called them the old people or base people. But they suffered too. He ordered everyone to throw away their ancient roots and beliefs, their religions, and replace them with the blind devotion to his extreme communist regime, the Khmer Rouge. It was headed by a secret standing committee called UNCAR, which means simply organisation. Pol Pot had absolute control. People were already weakened by the conflict and civil strife. They had been pounded by American bombs, a spillover from their war with Vietnam. To escape that horror, many had fled to the countryside and had already fled to the cities in search of shelter. When Pol Pot's men forced them out of the cities with no way to sustain themselves, thousands soon died. Later, he began killing everyone he thought would undermine his plan, even members of his own family. In only 3 years, 8 months and 20 days, his Khmer Rouge was responsible for the deaths of as many as 3 million people. This is the real start of our journey, but for those who were brought here in trucks, it was the end. Most came from the torture prison called Tol Slain in Phnom Penh. There they had been accused of crimes against the state. They came here at night, starved and terrified, bound and blindfolded. They had been beaten and tortured. The road was rutted and bumpy. They were told that they were being moved to a new house. Maybe some held on to that scrap of hope on the dark and terrible drive. Maybe some thought of home, of food to eat, a future, seeing their families again. They were wrong. Many knew in their hearts that this was the final journey. Perhaps some were even relieved. They had suffered enough. They may have arrived here in 1976 or 77 or 78. It doesn't matter. The same thing happened again and again. People were brought here to be killed. 2 or 3 trucks pulled up to this spot every few weeks, bringing 50 to 70 people. But in 1978, trucks began coming every day with as many as 300. There was no tall memorial stupa here, of course. A fence surrounded this place on 3 sides and a lake on the 4th. No one knew what lay within. A military base perhaps, a training camp. The people were dragged from the trucks and were either taken away to be killed or were led to a place just a few metres further on. The building that once stood here was known as the dark and gloomy detention. Prisoners were usually killed the night that they arrived, one by one. But after 1978, when there were too many to be killed right away, sometimes they were held until the next night and kept in a simple wooden structure. It had no windows and double thick walls. Sounds were muffled. In the darkness, no one inside could see each other or look out. Who were these people who were such a threat to Pol Pot's new pure society? They included educated people, professionals of all kinds. teachers, doctors and lawyers, anyone who spoke a foreign language or had soft hands or wore glasses. Monks and nuns were suspects too. Every city dweller, even people from the countryside who had fled the American bombs, all these were known as the New People or the 17th of April people, and were potential enemies of the glorious state, the Angkar. And of course, anyone who questioned or defied the Khmer Rouge, they were also traitors, but they were ordinary people, and most had done nothing. In prison, they were forced to write and sign false confessions that they had not done the work required of them, or they had stolen rice that belonged to all, or who had ignored an order. Many even confessed that when they were teenagers, they were spies for the American CIA or Russia's KGB. After days and weeks, even months of torture, many swore that their families and friends and fellow workers had done such things too. It's not so easy to judge what they did. Under such conditions, can you say that you would have done the same? Pol Pot studied radio electronics in France in the late 1940s. There he joined the Communist Party and came to revere the Chinese revolutionary chairman Mao Zedong. Back in Cambodia, he became a teacher and organised other teachers to advance his own radical revolutionary vision. But when he actually took over the country, he condemned teachers to death. Pol Pot never appeared in public, but he held absolute power. Like so many dictators, he built his army from boys and young men, mostly from the countryside, and who had little education or knowledge of the modern world. They were from the peasant class, which he called the old people. They were already racked with corruption and hunger and traumatized by the bombings as America tried to destroy North Vietnamese supply routes. 80% of the population lived in extreme poverty. The recruits were told that the city dwellers were selfish and evil and responsible for the way the country's people suffered. These young men were promised equality, prosperity, and a glorious future, and of course food and a steady job. Pol Pot's radical regime was officially called Democratic Kampuchea. It reinforced its ideas through dreadful sayings and slogans. These are some of them. 17th April people are parasitic plants. They are losers of war and prisoners of war. To keep you is no gain, to lose you is no loss. Why can we only see signs here instead of looking at buildings? The structures that stood here did not last long after the Khmer Rouge were driven out in 1979 by their own defectors and by the Vietnamese. Soon after this place was discovered, by that time the people were all starving, desperate for food and shelter, and people were angry. So those who lived nearby tore apart everything here and used it wherever they could. The simple buildings that once stood here was where the Khmer Rouge kept their officers. Record keeping was precise. Every prisoner and every truck had to be checked off on a list and accounted for. Occasionally, people had to sign the roster themselves. When they did, they were signing their own death warrant. Many Khmer Rouge soldiers were recruited as teenagers. Some were assigned to guard positions at Tol Slime prison in Phnom Penh. From there, they brought victims to this killing field. After killing everyone off the list, the Khmer Rouge soldiers dug deep pits or graves for the next shipment of prisoners. The Khmer Rouge picked Choeung Ek for its execution grounds, partly because it was out of the way and partly because it was already a graveyard used by local Chinese people. In this simple kiosk, the Chinese held traditional ceremonies for the deceased before burial. The coffin would be laid out and the family would gather here. How different from what had happened when the Khmer Rouge ripped apart our society. Religion was forbidden, so was commerce and education. Families were split up, even sent to different parts of the country. Men lived with men, women with women. Only small children stayed with their mothers. The reverence given to parents and to worship was now due to Angkar, the state. Once the killing fields was established here, there were no more burial ceremonies. A generator provided power for the lights that illuminated the executioners and for the loudspeaker system that blared revolutionary songs in the daytime. But at night the music was played to cover up the screams of prisoners being killed. Once more we're standing in front of a sign where there was once a building, this time a shed that housed chemical substances such as DDT in powder form. Sometimes victims were not actually dead when they were pushed into the pits that served as graves. DDT spread on their body finished the job. Its smell also disguised the stench of decay. Here is a sugar palm tree with huge spiky leaves. You can see many trees here in Cambodia. The sugar palm has many uses, for sweetening for example, for thatching, or to make palm wine, today even for biofuel. But take a close look at the stems. This supports those big fan-like leaves. Along them you will find dark, jagged ridges, like the teeth of a shark or a saw. These ridges were so hard and sharp that at Choeung Ek they were used to slit the prisoners' throats. When a person's throat is cut, he or she cannot shout or make a sound. It's hard to believe that people can do such things. Cambodians killing Cambodians. Over here there is a line of trees setting off the area where executions took place, the actual killing fields. Just beyond, there's a grave where 450 victims were murdered. We are standing at a grave where 450 bodies were found. A few steps away is a line of flowering trees that marks the boundary of the actual killing field. This is where the graves are. In 1979, a few months after Pol Pot's army was driven west by defectors from the Khmer Rouge and Vietnamese troops, the terrible truth was revealed. 129 mass graves scattered over 2.4 hectares. They held almost 20,000 victims, killed as quickly and efficiently as possible and pushed into pits, as if life had no meaning. Today, the largest of these mass graves has been marked and covered with a protective roof, like this one. As Pol Pot's paranoia grew, as many as 300 prisoners were killed here every single day. Today, this place is known as Choeung Ek Genocide Centre. With its trees and bird song, it has a peaceful feeling, but as you look down, you'll see the terrible truth in the fragments of bone and cloth at your feet. What you see here today is nothing compared to the horrors found by those who first discovered this place. The stench was unbearable. The graves were mounds like infected sores covering the earth. They had swelled as gases were released by decaying bodies. Some graves had cracked open, revealing dreadful sights. The shed that once stood here held tools intended for agriculture, construction and repair. At Choeung Ek, these tools were used for murder. The Khmer Rouge did not shoot people here. Bullets were expensive. Victims knelt in front of the pits that would soon be their graves, and they were beaten and hacked to death with whatever was cheap and available: axes, hoes, cart axles, bamboo poles, hammers, machetes. After the Khmer Rouge fled in 1979, the survivors who tore down the storage shed for its building materials also took those tools. You can see examples of the killing tools in the museum near the entrance. These tools were used a lot. Another of Pol Pot's slogans was, "Better to kill an innocent by mistake than to spare the enemy by mistake." Before Pol Pot, this place was a graveyard for the local Chinese community. This is the remains of a Chinese grave. You'll find others as you walk along. There were around 16 in the original cemetery. A few steps away there is a marked off area. It's one of many where bones and teeth still surface, especially during the rainy season as soil shifts and rain washes dirt away. In the 1980s they excavated 86 of the 129 graves here, unearthing almost 9,000 victims. Their bones, still covered with decaying matter, had to be dried and cleaned before they could be removed for study and reverent display. Remains were piled nearby. You can see photographs in the museum. From here you can see many depressions in the earth. They mark the pits of the mass graves. They are empty now, and with time and weather the soil has shifted. Some of the pits are now just shallow depressions in the ground. Once they were as deep as 5 meters. Today fragments still remain in the ground. The skulls and large bones from the bodies were put into the temporary wooden shelter until 1988, when the stupa was built to house them. First in 1980 and then in 2000 and 2001, forensic tests and skull measurements were done. They determined who died here and how many died and where they came from. Among the Cambodians remain the 9 Westerners, 1 Australian, 2 French and 6 Americans. But the world doesn't know what happened here, to this country. The borders with Thailand and Vietnam were closed with landmines, and only diplomats were allowed in or out. Before the Khmer Rouge came to Choeung Ek, this whole area was an orchard. There's a grove of fruit trees around here, and you'll find others as you walk around. People in this area have always been farmers, but under Angkar, farmers no longer own their land. It all belonged to the state. Pol Pot's goal was a society that was completely self-sufficient. The Angkar decreed that rice production must be tripled immediately, an impossible goal. Those driven from the cities were forced to join work brigades on collective farms. Work started before dawn and could last into the night, hauling manure, standing in water, planting rice, digging ditches, building dikes. But the people from the cities knew nothing of farming, and they got little or no training. They had been sent away with nothing. Money and personal possessions were officially banned. Many had little more than the clothes on their back and a rice bowl. No wonder thousands quickly died of starvation and disease. Those who managed to reach their assigned districts were expected to work 12 hours or more a day without stopping, often on just a couple of bowls of rice soup. Many couldn't keep up. They were simply worked to death. The people in charge were terrified of being punished as they did not meet quotas set for them by Angkar. So the harvests were exported to pay for weapons and supplies, especially to China, even when the workers on the farms were starving. This path heads away from the excavated graves. Bordering one end are rice fields. It runs along the top of the dike built to protect Choeung Ek from the flooding during the rainy season. This is where you can take a quiet walk along the lake, which is often only partly filled with water. On either side of the dike, there are 40 graves that are still undisturbed. Some are underwater. The curators have chosen to let the victims who lie here remain in peace. There are benches along the path. At one end, there is a kiosk that just juts out into the pond that is often carpeted with bright green water plants. These are good places to sit and listen or just think. Some of the people buried here, like the 166 discovered in this grave, were actually Khmer Rouge soldiers with uniforms and ID numbers. They came from the eastern zone on the Vietnamese border. Pol Pot had been secretive and paranoid from the start. By 1978, his new pure society was Disintegrating from the impossible expectations and mismanagement, the Angkar began to see enemies everywhere. A few words of accusation from a fellow worker could lead to imprisonment or even death. Many Khmer Rouge soldiers from the eastern zone defected, asking for help or joining the communist neighbours. If caught, they were killed as traitors. The soldiers who lay here have been decapitated, perhaps as an example to their comrades. According to the Khmer Rouge, the accusations of Vietnamese head, Cambodian body. The headless bodies were brought here for burial. Every 2 or 3 months, the staff of the centre gather rags, bones and teeth that have come to the surface. The clothes inside this box have been collected since 1980. Though mostly they are just rags, if you look at them closely, you will see some of them belong to children. They are here to help us think about the people who came to this place and never left. You may see also strips of cloth used for blindfolds, or cords for making hammocks that were used to bind hands. All have been preserved. Guards stripped the clothes from early victims and covered the bodies with DDT to mask the smell. But in the end, when so many were being killed at once, there was no time. In 2007, the 4 surviving members of the Standing Committee who ran the Khmer Rouge under Pol Pot were brought before a tribunal, a Cambodian court with international participation. As of 2011, these senior leaders were still on trial. A year later, the head of Tulsline prison was convicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Sometimes clothes were left on the ground as evidence for the prosecution. You may still notice scraps caught in the roots of a tree or even just lying around. In 1979, when Pol Pot was finally overthrown, he fled with what was left of the Khmer Rouge to the Thai border. For 10 more years, the last decade of the Cold War, the West continued to fear communism. Cambodia remained isolated from much of the world. Because Vietnam had established the new government, many countries refused to recognise it. Meanwhile, the Khmer Rouge regrouped in the jungle. Incredibly, the Khmer Rouge was still recognised as the legitimate leaders by most First World countries, the United Kingdom, the United States, Australia, France and Germany, and by the Chinese allies too. The Khmer Rouge were even given a seat at the UN. They sent representatives to New York City and even received financial aid while Cambodia struggled to put the country back together. It's hard to believe that that's what happened. And Pol Pot? He continued as leader of the Khmer Rouge for almost 20 more years. In 1997, when the group split into factions, he was finally put under house arrest. He died less than a year later, maybe poisoned by those who had once obeyed his every whim. But his life had been good. He had married a second wife, enjoyed his grandchildren, and it's said that he listened to the Voice of America every day on the radio. When he died, he was 82 years old. Some of his victims didn't even reach the age of 2. Of all the graves here at Choeung Ek, this may well be the most difficult to think about. The victims who died here were women and children, more than 100 of them. Most of the women who had been pushed into this pit had been stripped of their clothes. It is said that some of the buried women had been raped as well. But there was worse to come. Babies died here too. Many were killed before their mothers' eyes. This tree is called the killing tree. Soldiers grabbed babies by their legs, smashed their heads against it, and tossed them into the pit. All this at night in the glare of fluorescent lights, and all to the sound of revolutionary music. Why kill children? Why this brutal way? First it was quick and easy. Also, one member of a family was murdered, all the rest were often killed too, so no one would be left alive to seek revenge. Another Khmer Rouge slogan: to dig up the grass, one must remove even the roots. The people who discovered this place found blood, brain and fragments of bone on the bark of the tree. They did not understand why until the grave was opened. Since 1979, bones and bone fragments have been collected from the graves at Choeung Ek. There are many large bones and skulls in the memorial stupa that we'll talk about soon. Like the shreds of clothing, bone fragments kept coming to the surface. Caretakers collected them every few months. It's as if spirits of those who died here will not lie still. You'll see teeth among the bones. They could have been knocked out when the victims' heads were smashed. Teeth were also pulled out during torture or just fell out as the bodies decayed. It's hard to tell after all, the business of Choeung Ek was murder. This cherry tree looks very much like a Bodhi tree, the type of tree that Buddha sat under when he attained enlightenment. But no miracles happened here, though it is called the magic tree. The magic was the sound. Loudspeakers hung in the branches, broadcasting revolutionary songs throughout Choeung Ek at night. It is said that it gave outsiders the impression of a Khmer Rouge meeting. In fact, the music was to drown out the screams of people being murdered. It's hard to imagine what the prisoners waiting in the detention must have thought when they first heard the songs. This memorial stupa was built by the government of Cambodia in 1988 in memory of all those that died at Choeung Ek. Before that, their remains had been housed in a temporary shelter. As of 2011, over 300 killing fields have been discovered in Cambodia, places with mass graves containing tens to thousands of people. About 80 have been established as official monuments and marked by a memorial structure. Some killing fields are not accessible because they are surrounded by landmines or hidden deep in the jungle, and many have been lost. Some memorials are simple. This is the biggest one. The first 10 levels house almost 9,000 skulls arranged in scientific categories and labelled. As you look at the skulls, you can see how these victims were killed. A huge crack where a machete struck, for example, or a hole from a hammer. The upper levels are used for other major bones such as leg or arm bones and jaw bones. Rib and hip bones and smaller bones were left in the earth. There was no room to display them all. This was hardly the first case of genocide. I think people never thought it could happen here though. But it did. And the thing is, it can happen anywhere. It did in Nazi Germany and in Russia under Stalin and in China and Rwanda, in the US with its Native Americans and in Argentina and in Chile. Tragically, it will probably happen again. That's all for today, guys. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like and share, and join us next time.